1969 to 1974. You should take notes during this podcast. Pause it as necessary and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to identify the social and political forces that led to the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, understand the role of the Watergate scandal in Nixon's resignation in 1974, and assess the relative accomplishments and failures of Nixon's presidency. 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in our nation's modern history. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April, and presidential hopeful Robert F. Kennedy was shot down in June. In August, when activists protested the Vietnam War outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Americans watched on television as they were gassed and beaten bloody by police. Moreover, since 1964, cities such as the Watts section of Los Angeles, Newark, New Jersey, and Harlem in New York City rioted after African Americans had been killed or beaten by police and after the assassination of Martin Luther King. For many Americans, by the time of the presidential election in the fall of 1968, it was time for law and order to be restored. Richard Nixon appealed to these Americans, whom he termed the silent majority, on the promises that he would be the person to reinstate that law and order at home and achieve peace with honor in Vietnam. A brief glance at the state-by-state electoral college maps of the elections of 1964, when Democrat Lyndon Johnson won by a landslide, and of 1968, demonstrates the effectiveness of Nixon's campaign. Though Nixon earned only a tiny majority of the popular vote in '68, he swept the Electoral College. In addition to promising law and order and peace with honor, Nixon also campaigned on a quote-unquote states' rights platform, which many historians see as his wink to Southern whites opposed to the civil rights legislation recently promoted by Democrats. Nixon's so-called Southern strategy was designed to attract these disaffected white Southern Democrats to the Republican Party, which worked reasonably well in 1968. The states in purple here on the right went for segregationist candidate George Wallace, and the Southern strategy worked overwhelmingly well in 1972. It's also interesting to compare the map of 1968 on the right with that of 2016 here at the bottom, when Republican Donald Trump also promised to restore law and order to a so-called silent majority following a series of protests by African Americans against police brutality. Nixon's landslide in the election of 1972, here seen at the left, makes his paranoia during the campaign and the resulting Watergate scandal all the more ironic. Several Nixon aides associated with the group, the Committee to Re-elect the President, later given the acronym CREEP or CREEP by Nixon's detractors, decided it was necessary to gain knowledge of the Democratic Party's campaign strategy. So, they twice broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., to wiretap its phones and photograph documents. After the so-called burglars were arrested, Nixon, who might not have ordered the break-in, did order the CIA to prevent the FBI from further investigating the matter. News regarding the Watergate break-in and subsequent cover-up by Nixon and top aides was broken by a series of news organizations, especially journalists at Time, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, two young journalists at the Post, used an anonymous source they called Deep Throat to show that the scandal reached into the highest ranks of the Justice Department, FBI, CIA, and White House. Nixon attacked the press as harboring a liberal bias against him, but the stories of 1972 did not prevent his re-election. Nevertheless, Nixon went on to orchestrate a cover-up of the cover-up, firing Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, and John Dean in order to distance himself from Watergate's ringleaders. Nevertheless, a special Select Senate subcommittee began investigating Watergate in February 1973 in a series of televised hearings. Millions of Americans heard here how the president had installed listening devices into the Oval Office. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox in the Senate subpoenaed the tapes, but Nixon refused to turn them over, citing executive privilege. The president then had Cox fired, but the issue of whether Nixon had to turn the tapes over went all the way up to the Supreme Court. On July 24, 1974, the court unanimously invalidated Nixon's claims of executive privilege over the tapes in U.S. v. Nixon. 6 days later, the president released the tapes, which showed that money from the committee to re-elect the president went not only to the initial Watergate burglars, but also later to top aides in order to maintain their silence about the break-in. This action later led to the Judiciary Committee recommending impeachment based on the initial criminal charge of obstruction of justice. Later, it added abuse of power and contempt of Congress to the list. On August 5, 1974, a previously unreleased tape proved that Nixon knew of the break-in on June 23, 1972, just a few days after it had occurred. This quote-unquote smoking gun tape convinced several holdout congressmen from the Judiciary Committee subcommittee to vote for impeachment when the full House voted. Once President Nixon found out that the Senate conviction was all but assured, he resigned from office on the evening of August 8, 1974. Despite the fact that Richard M. Nixon is, so far, the only U.S. president to have ever resigned from office, his 6.5 years in office did witness some impressive achievements. He reestablished diplomatic relations with a 1972 visit to China, for example. These had been all but non-existent since that country's communist revolution in 1949. Nixon also issued in a period of détente, or an easing of Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union. During his presidency, NASA also put Americans on the moon. Back at home, Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, in 1970 and ended the military draft while drawing the war in Vietnam down to a close. Nevertheless, the Watergate scandal and his resignation from office remain the defining features of Nixon's presidency. In the next podcast, we'll explore the effects of Nixon's resignation on the U.S. and on the presidency of his successor, his Vice President Gerald Ford. For now, review the learning objectives for this podcast. Write out each one in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer the learning objectives. Good luck!